The red wine pooled across the white Carrara marble floor like a fresh, jagged wound, spreading its crimson stain toward the worn hem of Beatrice Miller's skirt. She did not cry out, nor did she flinch when the expensive crystal glass shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds at her feet. Instead, she slowly lowered her 68-year-old frame onto the cold, unforgiving stone, her knees popping with a sound that echoed the fragility of her own bones. Julian did not offer a hand. He did not even offer an apology. He simply stood there, adjusted the silk cuffs of his $3,000 suit, and looked down at his sister as if she were a persistent shadow that had finally dared to take up space. "Stay on your knees and clean it up, Beatrice," he said, his voice as sharp and sterile as a surgical blade. "You are getting slow in your old age, and we have the Thanksgiving Gala tonight. I cannot have my guests seeing a mess in the kitchen." Beatrice said nothing, her cracked, calloused fingers reaching for a cloth. This was her brother, the boy she had once carried across the flooded streets of Newark when the rain was too heavy for his small legs. This was the man for whom she had poured every drop of her lifeblood into an altar of ambition. As she wiped the wine, she felt the phantom weight of 32 years pressing down on her spine. 32 years of double shifts at the oncology ward, where the smell of antiseptic and the heavy silence of the dying had become her only companions. She remembered the nights when the winter wind howled through the cracked windows of their cramped apartment in the slums, and she would wrap her own coat around Julian so he could study his law books by the light of a single flickering candle. Her hands, now gnarled and trembling, were the living record of that devotion. They were stained not just by the wine she cleaned today, but by the chemicals, the blood, and the endless labor of a woman who had forgotten how to exist for herself. She had been the martyr of the Miller family, a role she accepted with the silent sanctity of a saint. When Julian had failed in his first business venture 6 years ago, drowning in a sea of debt that totaled $402,000, it was Beatrice who had stepped into the fire. She did not hesitate. She had walked into the local jeweler and laid down the only piece of gold she had ever owned, her father's pocket watch. It was a heavy, rhythmic piece of history that had survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars, the only thing her father had left her besides his name. She had watched the jeweler pry it open, seen the tiny gears of her heritage exposed, and felt a part of her soul go cold when he handed her the check. That money, combined with every cent of her retirement savings, had bought Julian his second chance. It had built the foundation of his real estate empire in Bergen County, the very empire that now looked down upon her from the heights of a mansion she was barely allowed to walk through. The contrast was a cruel irony that Beatrice chewed on every single day. Julian lived in the light, surrounded by the glitter of New Jersey's elite, while she was relegated to the small, sweltering attic room 51 miles away from the life she once knew. She was the invisible ghost in the machine of his success. She cooked the meals, she ironed the silk shirts, and she tended to the garden, all while being told she was a guest who should be grateful for the roof over her head. Clara, Julian's wife, was even colder. To Clara, Beatrice was an embarrassment, a relic of a poverty-stricken past that needed to be hidden when the neighbors from the country club came over for cocktails. They treated her like a servant who happened to share their last name, a woman whose dignity had been traded for the security of a bed that wasn't hers. As Beatrice finished cleaning the floor, she caught her reflection in the polished toe of Julian's shoe. She saw a woman who looked 10 years older than her age, her hair a thin silver halo, her skin mapped with the exhaustion of 3 decades of nursing the terminally ill. She had spent her youth holding the hands of strangers as they took their final breaths, offering them a comfort she was now denied in her own home. She had been the bridge over troubled water for everyone else, yet she was the one currently drowning in the shallowest of pools. Her heart felt like a piece of dry timber, ready to snap under the weight of the upcoming gala. This event was Julian's crowning achievement, a night to showcase his wealth and influence under the guise of Thanksgiving charity. To Beatrice, it was merely another night of invisible labor, another night of being told to stay in the shadows so as not to ruin the aesthetic of his perfect life. She remembered the day she had officially retired from the hospital. The staff had given her a small cake and a card signed by dozens of doctors and nurses who called her the backbone of the ward. They had praised her for her selflessness, for the way she would work the Christmas shifts so the younger nurses could go home to their families. She had walked out of those sliding glass doors with a sense of pride, believing that she would finally be able to rest, that Julian would welcome her with open arms and the gratitude she had earned. Instead, she found a man who had replaced his memory of their struggle with the cold, hard currency of status. He did not see the sister who had paid his tuition. He saw a burden who reminded him of the dirt he had come from. The $402,000 she had given him was never spoken of as a loan or a gift. It was treated as an erased debt, a footnote in his biography of a self-made man. In the attic, Beatrice kept a small wooden box under her bed. Inside were the letters of gratitude from the families of her former patients and a single photograph of her parents. They were simple people who believed in the sanctity of family, who taught her that love was a verb, something you did until your fingers bled. She often wondered what her father would say if he saw his son standing over his daughter, demanding she clean the floor like a common scullery maid. The pain in her lower back was a constant, throbbing reminder of the years spent lifting patients, of the miles walked in hospital corridors that stretched to the horizon. She had given the marrow of her bones to Julian, and in return, he gave her the scraps of his excess. He was a man who knew the price of every square foot of New Jersey real estate, but knew nothing of the value of a human soul. The house began to hum with the frantic energy of the gala preparations. Caterers arrived with crates of champagne and silver platters, their footsteps thundering through the hallways like a coming storm. Clara was shouting orders from the grand staircase, her voice a shrill symphony of entitlement. Beatrice stood in the center of the kitchen, her hands finally dry, watching the chaos with a detached sense of mourning. She was expected to help with the final touches, to ensure the centerpieces were perfect and the linens were crisp, yet she was forbidden from appearing in the photographs. She was the sacrificial martyr at the feast of her own undoing. She felt a strange, cold clarity beginning to settle in the pit of her stomach, a feeling she hadn't felt since the nights she spent in the intensive care unit. It was the clarity that comes just before the end, the realization that the body can only take so much before the spirit must revolt. Julian walked back into the kitchen, checking his platinum watch, a watch that cost more than Beatrice had earned in her final 2 years of nursing combined. "Remember, Beatrice," he said without looking at her, "you are to stay in the kitchen once the guests arrive. Clara doesn't want you wandering into the ballroom with those hands of yours. It ruins the atmosphere." He gestured vaguely at her gnarled fingers, the fingers that had once stitched his torn clothes and paid for his education. Beatrice looked at her hands, truly looked at them, and for the first time in 32 years, she didn't feel shame. She felt a simmering, righteous anger that tasted like copper. The man standing before her was her brother by blood, but he was a stranger by choice. He was a monument to her own misguided kindness, a monster she had fed with her own dreams until she had nothing left but the attic and the memories of a life spent in service to others. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture Julian took for submission, but it was actually a mask for the fire ignited in her eyes. "Yes, Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the clinking of silver and glass. "I will stay where I belong." She watched him walk away, his gait confident and predatory, and she knew that the Thanksgiving gala would indeed be a night that no one in Bergen County would ever forget. The long suffering of Beatrice Miller was reaching its zenith, and the altar she had built for her brother was about to become the stage for his judgment. She reached into her pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of a small object she had kept hidden, a secret she had carried through the 51 miles of her exile. The sacrifice was over. The time for the divine reckoning was drawing near, hidden beneath the humble exterior of a woman who had finally realized that her love had no rangjoi and her mercy had finally run dry. The kitchen was a furnace of cruel expectations, the air thick with the scent of roasted turkey and the sharp, artificial citrus of the expensive cleaning agents Clara insisted upon. Beatrice stood before the industrial-sized oven, her face flushed a deep, painful crimson, beads of sweat tracking through the deep lines of her forehead like rivers through a parched landscape. In her hands, she held a simple stoneware dish containing a pumpkin pie, its crust crimped with the same meticulous care she had once used to dress surgical wounds. This wasn't just a dessert, it was a ghost. It was their mother's recipe, the one that had filled their drafty Newark kitchen with a sense of safety during the winters when they had nothing but flour, sugar, and hope. To Beatrice, the pie was a sacred vessel of their shared blood, a humble offering of the love that had survived 32 years of her unrelenting toil. Outside the swinging double doors, the Thanksgiving Gala was in full swing. The sound of a professional string quartet drifted into the kitchen, a refined, skeletal melody that seemed to mock the heavy thud of Beatrice's heart. She could hear the tinkling of crystal and the low, rehearsed hum of the New Jersey elite, men who controlled the flow of millions and women whose jewelry cost more than Beatrice's entire life's work. Julian's voice rose above the rest, a polished baritone roar of artificial joy. He was telling a story, no doubt a fabricated tale of his own rugged beginnings, carefully scrubbed of the reality of the sister who had scrubbed floors so he could wear a tie. Beatrice looked down at her pie, her vision blurring for a moment. Her legs were screaming, the varicose veins throbbing with a rhythmic agony that felt like fire under her skin. She had been on her feet for 7 hours straight, preparing the base for the caterers, and now, her only wish was to place this one piece of their true history on the grand table in the ballroom. She adjusted her apron, smoothed her silver hair, and took a trembling breath. She didn't want the spotlight. She only wanted Julian to remember. She wanted him to taste the cinnamon and nutmeg and see the girl who had skipped her own meals so he could have a second helping of stew. With the pie held like a holy relic, she pushed through the double doors and entered the world of light and gold. The transition was jarring. The ballroom was a sea of black tuxedos and silk gowns in shades of emerald and sapphire. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen explosions of wealth, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on everything they touched. As Beatrice stepped onto the polished parquet floor, the music seemed to falter. The refined hum of conversation dipped, replaced by a cold, curious silence that spread through the room like a frost. She felt the eyes immediately. They were not eyes of warmth or holiday spirit. They were the clinical, judgmental eyes of a predator looking at a wounded animal. She saw the way the women leaned in to whisper behind their gloved hands, their gazes skating over her worn orthopedic shoes and her faded cotton dress that Clara had ordered her to hide under a white apron. She felt like a dark stain on a pristine canvas. But she kept moving, her focus locked on the long mahogany table at the center of the room, which groaned under the weight of silver platters and fine china. Julian was standing at the head of the table, a glass of vintage champagne in one hand, his other hand resting possessively on the small of Clara's back. He looked magnificent, a king of his own making, his skin bronzed and his teeth white against his expensive tan. As Beatrice approached, the silence became absolute. Even the quartet stopped playing, the last note of a violin trailing off into an awkward, jagged end. Julian's smile didn't just fade, it vanished, replaced by a mask of such profound disgust that Beatrice felt her knees buckle. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving her gasping in a vacuum of social rejection. Julian set his glass down with a controlled violence that made the crystal chime. Beatrice reached the edge of the table, her hands shaking so violently that the pie tin rattled against the stoneware. "Julian," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the vast, hollow space. "I brought the pie, Mother's recipe. I thought, for Thanksgiving we could—" "Old woman!" Julian's voice erupted, a jagged thunderclap that shattered the last of her dignity. The words didn't just hurt. They physically recoiled through her, a verbal assault that felt like a blow to the chest. "Who gave you permission to touch this table? Who gave you permission to bring that garbage into this room?" He gestured with a flick of his wrist at the pie, his eyes burning with a cold reptilian fury. The guests gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like 1,000 paper cuts. Clara stepped forward, her face a mask of practiced horror, her voice a sharp, high-pitched needle. "Julian, darling, look at her hands. She's getting flour on the linen. I told her to stay in the attic. She's clearly not—" Well. Julian took a step toward his sister, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "You are a guest in this house, Beatrice," he hissed, his voice dropping to a lethal, intimate whisper that the entire room could still hear. "A guest in the attic. You are here because of my charity, because I cannot have the neighbors say I let my sister rot in the streets of Newark. But look at you. You are a stain on this evening. You are a reminder of everything I have worked to bury." He looked around the room, as if seeking validation from the men in their $4,000 suits. "My sister has always struggled with her place," he told the crowd, his voice regaining its polished, patronizing edge. "She lives in a world of the past. Beatrice, take that filth back to the kitchen before I have the security escort you out." Beatrice stood frozen, the weight of the stoneware dish suddenly becoming an unbearable burden, as if it were filled with lead rather than pumpkin. She looked at the guests, seeing the pity and the mockery, the way they looked at her as if she were a ghost that had forgotten to stay dead. Her heart felt as if it were being crushed in a cold iron fist. The 32 years of nursing, the $402,000 she had given him, the 51 miles of distance she had traveled to be near her only living relative, it all meant nothing. She was not a sister. She was a liability. She was the before picture in a story Julian wanted everyone to believe started with $1 million and ended with a mansion. The pie slipped. It wasn't a conscious choice, but a failure of her muscles, a collapse of the very spirit that had held her upright for 6 decades. The stoneware dish hit the mahogany table with a sickening thud, then slid off, crashing onto the parquet floor. The orange filling splattered across the white silk of Clara's gown and the polished leather of Julian's shoes. A scream of pure, unadulterated rage tore from Clara's throat. Julian's face turned a shade of purple that Beatrice had only seen in patients suffering from terminal heart failure. "You pathetic, clumsy fool!" Julian roared. He didn't even check to see if she was hurt by the shards of stoneware that had peppered her ankles. He only saw the mess. He only saw the disruption of his perfection. He grabbed Beatrice by the arm, his fingers digging into her thin flesh with a strength that left immediate, darkening bruises. He dragged her toward the double doors, the guests parting like the Red Sea before a vengeful god. "You will go to your room," he snarled into her ear, his breath smelling of expensive wine and cold ambition. "You will stay there until every guest has left this property, and tomorrow we will discuss your future, because clearly you can no longer be trusted to exist in polite society." He shoved her through the kitchen doors with such force that she stumbled, falling against the stainless steel prep table. The doors swung shut behind him, muffled by the sudden burst of laughter and music that resumed in the ballroom, the sound of a world closing its doors on a soul it had deemed worthless. Beatrice stayed there, slumped against the cold metal, the silence of the kitchen far more deafening than the gala outside. She looked down at her hands, which were now stained with the orange of the pie and the red of her own blood, where a shard of pottery had sliced her thumb. The UATUC, the profound, suffocating sense of injustice, rose in her throat like bile. She had given him everything. She had traded her youth, her beauty, her health, and her father's only legacy to ensure Julian Miller never had to know the cold. And in return, he had branded her a stain. He had called the very essence of their mother's love garbage. She didn't cry. The time for tears had passed 32 years ago. Instead, she felt a cold, crystalline stillness settle over her. The sacrificial martyr had been humiliated on the altar of her own making, but in that humiliation, the chains of her devotion finally snapped. She was no longer bound by the blood they shared, for Julian had spilled it on the floor like common wine. As she stood up, wiping the blood from her hand onto her apron, Beatrice Miller looked toward the stairs leading to her attic room. But she wasn't going there to hide. She was going there to finish what she had started. The storm was no longer outside. It was inside her, and it was silent, and it was deadly. The throbbing in Beatrice's thumb was a rhythmic, agonizing reminder of the world that had just shattered around her ankles. She did not climb the stairs to the attic as Julian had commanded. To do so would be to accept the role of a ghost, to crawl into the dark and wait for the end of a life she had already surrendered to his ambition. Instead, she moved like a shadow through the service corridor, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian runners that muffled the triumphant swells of the orchestra in the ballroom. She needed a bandage, something to stop the slow, persistent leak of her lifeblood. But as she approached the heavy oak doors of Julian's private study, she heard the sound of her own name. It was not spoken with the reverence one might give a sister or a savior, but with the clinical detachment of a merchant discussing a spoiled piece of inventory. Beatrice froze, her back pressed against the cold wainscoting of the hallway. Through the inch of space left by the unlatched door, the golden light of the study spilled out, smelling of expensive tobacco and the sharp, medicinal scent of Julian's favourite 20-year-old scotch. She could see Julian through the gap, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his silk sleeves rolled up as he leaned over a mahogany desk that cost more than Beatrice had earned in 5 years of nursing. Clara was beside him, her white silk gown still stained with the orange smear of the pumpkin pie. Her face no longer a mask of social perfection, but a jagged landscape of greed and resentment. "She's a ticking time bomb, Julian," Clara hissed, her voice a jagged needle of sound that pierced the silence of the corridor. "Did you see the way she looked tonight? That little performance with the pie was just the beginning. The neighbors are already asking questions. They think she's losing her mind. And quite frankly, it's an embarrassment I will no longer tolerate. This house is meant for winners, not for senile relics from Newark." Julian took a long, slow draw from his glass, the ice clinking with a sound that felt like teeth gnashing in the darkness. "I know," Julian replied, his voice devoid of the warmth he had once used to beg for her tuition money. "I've already contacted the administrator at the New Hope Senior Facility. It's a locked ward, 60 miles from here. No one from our circle will ever have to see her again. But we have to be careful. If she catches wind of it before the papers are filed, she might try to move the money." "Money?" Clara laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made Beatrice's skin crawl. "You mean the pittance she has left?" "It's $102,000, Clara," Julian said, his voice dropping into a tone of predatory calculation. It's the last of her hospital pension and the life insurance from the hospital. She thinks it's her safety net, but I've already drafted the involuntary commitment papers under the dementia loophole. Once the doctor signs off on her mental instability, which, after tonight's public breakdown, will be easy to prove, I will be appointed as her legal guardian. That $102,000 will cover the back taxes on the commercial strip in Paramus and the remaining debt on your new Mercedes. She's lived off my charity long enough. It's time she paid her way. Beatrice felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been plunged into the frozen depths of the Hudson River. The blood in her veins seemed to turn to shards of ice, tearing at her heart from the inside. She had already given him $402,000. She had given him 32 years of her labor, the marrow of her bones, and the very gold from her father's pocket. She had stood in the oncology ward for thousands of nights, breathing in the scent of death so he could breathe in the scent of success. And now, as she stood bleeding in the hallway, the brother she had raised was planning to steal the last $102,000 of her existence and lock her in a cage like a rabid animal. True betrayal is never a single blow. It is the violent unraveling of a lifetime's worth of devotion. When the very foundation of one's existence is rooted in selfless love, the discovery of such calculated cruelty acts as a spiritual extinction. It is the precise moment when the victim's internal compass shatters, leaving no North Star to guide the soul back to its former innocence. This collapse marks the end of a long-held delusion, a brutal awakening where the warmth of sacrifice is instantly replaced by the frigid clarity of truth. In this hollow silence, the martyr dies, and a witness to reality is born. Beatrice felt the definition of her own identity, sister, protector, provider, evaporate into the dim light of the corridor. The man in that room was not her brother. He was a parasite that had grown fat on the host of her kindness. Clara leaned over the desk, her fingers tracing the edge of a legal document. "And the house?" she asked, her eyes glittering with a feverish light. "The deed is still in both your names because of that old tax shelter you set up." Julian's face twisted into a smug, dark grin. "Once she's declared incompetent, her signature is void. I'll have sole power of attorney. I'll sell her half to my shell company for $1, and then the Bergen County property will be ours, free and clear. She'll be in a white room with a plastic tray, and we'll finally be able to breathe. She was never one of us, Clara. She's just a nurse. She's used to being around the dying. I'm just helping her reach the finish line a little faster." Beatrice looked down at her hands. They were trembling, but not with the weakness of age. They were shaking with the primal electric current of a woman who had finally realized that the predator in the house was the one she had fed from her own plate. She remembered every shift, every hour of overtime, every patient she had comforted, and she realized that she had more strength in one gnarled finger than Julian Miller had in his entire hollow body. The $102,000 they coveted was not just money. It was her dignity, her final line of defense, and the blood-soaked proof of her life's work. They thought her mind was failing, that her spirit was broken by the 51 miles of her exile and the weight of their mockery. They were wrong. She felt a sudden, sharp clarity, a coldness that was not death, but a new kind of life. The dementia they planned to use as a weapon would become the shield she would use to destroy them. She realized that Julian's entire empire was built on a foundation of her money and his lies, a house of cards standing in the path of a hurricane he hadn't seen coming. He had called her a guest in the attic, but he had forgotten that she was the one who had bought the land, paid the mortgage, and held the keys to the truth. The $102,000 was still in her account, and the deed still bore the name Beatrice Miller in ink that had not yet faded. She slowly stepped back from the door, her movement fluid and silent, a skill learned from decades of navigating hospital rooms in the dead of night. She did not go to the kitchen to find a bandage. She went to the back stairs, her mind working with the precision of a master architect. She saw the path forward, a jagged, beautiful road that led through the wreckage of her heart to a place of supreme justice. She would let them believe they were winning. She would let Julian drink his scotch and Clara plan her new wardrobe. She would let them believe the old woman was cowering in the attic, waiting for the end. As she reached the top of the stairs, she looked out the small circular window toward the sprawling, light-filled estate of Bergen County. She didn't see a home. She saw a battlefield. The sacrificial martyr had been discarded, left for dead by the very person she had saved. But in that discarded heap of broken dreams, Beatrice Miller found the one thing Julian had never possessed: a conscience that had finally been liberated from the burden of unrequited love. She would use their greed as the rope to hang their reputations. She would use their arrogance as the fuel for their own public destruction. The Thanksgiving Gala was still roaring below, a symphony of the soulless, but Beatrice was no longer listening to the music. She was listening to the sound of her own heartbeat, a steady, iron drum of resolve. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of reclaiming what was hers. Tomorrow, she would move the $102,000. Tomorrow, she would contact the shadows of her own past, the people she had helped when Julian was too busy being a winner. The boy she had carried through the floods of Newark had grown up to be a monster, and it was her responsibility, as the sister who had given him life, to be the one who finally took back the power he had stolen. She walked into her small attic room and sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room finally matching the silence of her soul. The martyr was gone. The fan set. The reckoning was about to begin. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to visualize the fall of the house of Miller. When she opened them again, they were as cold and bright as the stars over New Jersey, and they were filled with the light of a terrible, beautiful justice. The morning sun that rose over the manicured lawns of Bergen County was cold and indifferent, casting long skeletal shadows across the Miller estate. Beatrice Miller stood at her small attic window, watching the frost crawl across the glass like tiny crystal veins. For the first time in 32 years, the ache in her bones felt like a source of power rather than a burden of exhaustion. She looked at the darkening bruises on her arm where Julian had gripped her the night before, and she did not feel the sting of his cruelty. She felt the clarity of a woman who had already walked through the fire and emerged as something harder, something forged in the absolute zero of a brother's betrayal. The sacrificial martyr had been buried beneath the ruins of the pumpkin pie on the ballroom floor, and in her place stood a woman with a memory as long as the 51 miles between her past and her future. She moved through the house like a silent storm, a ghost that had suddenly regained its weight. While Julian and Clara slept in their silk sheets, dreaming of the $102,000 they intended to steal, Beatrice was already at work. She did not use the grand staircase. She used the back service stairs, the ones meant for the invisible people. She reached the kitchen and made a single phone call. It was to Detective Harrison, a man whose mother Beatrice had cared for during 3 agonizing years in the oncology ward. She had been the one to hold the old woman's hand during the final hours, while Harrison was stuck in a precinct briefing. He had told her then, with tears in his eyes, that he owed her a debt that time could never erase. Beatrice spoke to him now, with a voice that was as calm and sharp as a winter morning. "I need you to look into the commercial holdings of Julian Miller," she said. "I need to know about the back taxes, the shell companies, and the dementia loophole he discussed in his study." Harrison didn't ask why. He simply told her to be at the Newark Central Bank by 10 o'clock. The trip to the bank was a journey through her own history. As she drove the old sedan Julian usually forbid her from using, she passed the hospital where she had spent 32 years of her life. She saw the faces of 1,000 patients in her mind, and she realized that she was finally treating the most terminal case of her career, the rot of her own family. At the bank, she met Mr. Henderson, a manager who had known her since she was a young nurse, depositing her very first paycheck. Julian had assumed that the old woman was too technologically illiterate to manage her own finances, too tired to notice the way he had slowly tethered her accounts to his own. He was wrong. Beatrice sat in the mahogany-panelled office and revoked every power of attorney, every joint access, and every digital key Julian possessed. She moved the $102,000, the final remnants of her life's blood, into a private trust that required a triple authentication process he would never be able to bypass. She felt the weight of the money not as wealth, but as the return of her own breath. But the money was only the beginning. She visited a legal aid office in the heart of the city, showing them the deed to the Bergen County property. The house Julian called his palace, the mansion he used to humiliate her, was technically a joint asset, a tax shelter he had created using her pristine credit and her initial investment of $402,000. Because he had been arrogant enough to believe she would never read the fine print, he had left a trail of legal breadcrumbs that led directly to her doorstep. She filed for an emergency injunction and a restraining order, not to take effect immediately, but to be held like a loaded weapon until the perfect moment. She was not just reclaiming a house, she was reclaiming the ground beneath her feet. When she returned to the mansion, the atmosphere was thick with the smug silence of predators who believe the trap has already closed. Julian and Clara were in the dining room, sipping midday coffee, looking over the commitment papers they expected her to sign under the guise of estate planning. Beatrice entered the room, her expression a perfect mask of the submissive, broken sister they expected to see. She did not look them in the eye. She kept her gaze on the floor, her shoulders slightly hunched, playing the part of the martyr one last time. Julian smiled, a thin, oily expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Beatrice," he said, his voice dripping with a false saccharine concern. "We were just talking about your health. After the incident at the Gala, we think it's best if we move things along. We've found a lovely place for you to rest." Beatrice nodded slowly, her heart beating with the steady rhythm of a ticking bomb. "I understand, Julian," she whispered. "I only want what is best for the family." Clara smirked, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "Good. We'll have a quiet dinner tonight, just the three of us, to finalize everything. No more messes, Beatrice, just a final farewell to the old ways." The dinner that evening was a masterpiece of cold, calculated irony. Beatrice insisted on preparing the meal herself, a final act of service that Julian allowed with a condescending pat on the shoulder. She spent the afternoon in the kitchen, but she wasn't cooking with love. She was cooking with the precision of an executioner. The table was set with the finest silver, the crystal glasses gleaming like frozen tears under the chandelier. Julian and Clara sat at opposite ends, looking like the king and queen of a kingdom built on sand. Beatrice served them in silence, moving between them like a shadow. She brought out the roast beef, the glazed carrots, and the expensive wine Julian had bought with her money. She watched them eat, her eyes cold and unblinking. The silence at the table was heavy, pregnant with the secrets Beatrice was holding. Julian was in high spirits, talking about the new commercial strip he was going to buy once the funds were cleared. He mocked the guests from the night before, laughing about how they had fallen for his charity act. Clara talked about the renovations she would make to the attic once it was vacant. They spoke about Beatrice as if she weren't there, as if she were already a piece of furniture they were planning to donate to a thrift store. Beatrice stood by the sideboard, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked at Julian, The boy who had once cried when he fell and scraped his knee. The boy she had comforted with songs and soup. She searched for a shred of the brother she loved, but she found only a hollow shell of greed. "You're very quiet tonight, Beatrice," Julian noted, wiping his mouth with a silk napkin. "Finally realized that your time is up? Or are you just mourning that ridiculous pie?" He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the vaulted ceiling. Beatrice didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head. "I was just thinking about the $402,000, Julian," she said, her voice a low, melodic hum that cut through his laughter like a razor. "And the 32 years of shifts I worked so you could sit in that chair. I was thinking about the pocket watch I sold, the one that belonged to our father. I was wondering if you ever think about the price of things, or only the cost." Julian's face darkened, his fork clattering against the china. "Don't start with that sentimental Newark garbage again. We're beyond that. You're lucky I'm even giving you a room in a facility. Most brothers would have left you in a shelter." Beatrice felt a cold smile touch her lips, a ghost of the expression that made Clara shift uncomfortably in her seat. "I'm not sentimental, Julian. I'm just observant. You see, a nurse learns to recognize the signs of a failing system before the patient even knows they're sick. You think you're at the peak of your power, but the foundation is already gone." "What are you talking about?" Julian snapped, his eyes narrowing. Beatrice stepped closer to the table, her presence suddenly filling the room, her stature seeming to grow until she loomed over them both. "I'm talking about the fact that as of 3 o'clock this afternoon, the $102,000 you were planning to steal is gone. I'm talking about the fact that your power of attorney has been revoked, and the Bergen County mansion is currently under a legal freeze. I'm talking about Detective Harrison, who is currently reviewing the tax records for your shell companies in Paramus." Julian stood up so quickly his chair toppled over, his face a mask of disbelief and burgeoning panic. "You're lying. You don't have the brains to do that. You're just an old woman." Beatrice didn't move. She stood her ground, her eyes burning with the fire of 1,000 nights of suffering. "I was an old woman when I paid for your car. I was an old woman when I saved you from bankruptcy. But tonight, Julian, I am the woman who is taking back her life." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Julian's ragged breathing. Clara looked between them, her face pale, her hands trembling as she realized the silk gown she was wearing was no longer a symbol of status, but a costume for a tragedy. Beatrice looked at the dinner they had just consumed, the meal she had served them with the cold grace of a fan set. She had reclaimed the keys. She had moved the money. She had summoned the law. All that remained was the stage, the public reckoning where the world would see Julian Miller for exactly what he was. "Stay in this house tonight, Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper of supreme authority. "Sleep in your expensive bed, because tomorrow, the gala isn't for charity. Tomorrow, the gala is for the truth." She turned and walked out of the dining room, her footsteps steady and proud, leaving the predators to choke on the ashes of their own greed. The storm had passed the kitchen. It was now a hurricane in the ballroom, and Beatrice Miller was the only one who knew how to survive the wind. The final morning of the Miller dynasty arrived not with the triumphant blare of trumpets, but with the cold, sterile silence of a hospital corridor. Beatrice Miller stood in her small attic room, but she was no longer dressed in the faded cotton rags of a discarded sister. She had pulled from the bottom of her trunk the stiff, white, starch-pressed uniform of a head nurse, the armor she had worn for 32 years. The fabric was a bit tight across her shoulders, which had bent under the weight of her brother's greed, but as she fastened the silver pins, she felt the iron return to her spine. This was the garment of a woman who had seen the raw truth of the human condition, who had bathed the wounds of the dying and held the hands of the forgotten. It was the uniform of a saint, and today It would be the shroud of a traitor. Downstairs, the grand ballroom of the Bergen County mansion was a scene of frantic, desperate recovery. Julian was attempting to host a reconciliation brunch for the local investors and socialites who had witnessed the previous night's disaster. He had spent the morning on the phone, spinning a web of lies about Beatrice's mental decline and his own saintly patience. He needed them to believe he was still the golden boy of New Jersey real estate, even as the walls of his empire were being eaten away by the debt of $703,000 he had hidden from everyone, including Clara. He stood in the center of the room, his voice loud and hollow, a glass of mimosa trembling in his hand. Then, the double doors at the head of the grand staircase swung open. Beatrice did not descend. She appeared. The white of her uniform was so bright under the crystal chandeliers that it seemed to burn the eyes of everyone in the room. She walked down the stairs with a slow, rhythmic deliberation that silenced the crowd. Her face was a mask of marble, her eyes two chips of frozen flint. She carried a thick, leather-bound ledger in one hand and a stack of legal documents in the other. Julian's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled grey. He saw the uniform. He saw the dignity he thought he had successfully buried beneath 40 tons of mockery. He felt the gaze of the room shift from his polished lies to the raw, uncomfortable truth of the woman who had built him. Fear, sharp and jagged, tore through his gut, and as fear often does in men of his caliber, it turned into a violent, screeching arrogance. "Old woman!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a dying bird. "Who gave you permission? Who gave you permission to come down here in that costume? You are supposed to be packed. You are a guest in this house, and I have given you your orders." The room went deathly silent. Even the caterers stopped pouring champagne. Beatrice reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped exactly 3 feet from him. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a fanchette, a living judgment. "This house does not belong to you, Julian," Beatrice said, her voice not a scream, but a low, resonant bell that carried to every corner of the ballroom. "This house was built on 32 years of double shifts and the $402,000 I poured into your hollow soul. It was built on the pocket watch of a father you have forgotten and the tears of a mother you have betrayed. You call me a guest? No, I am the owner." Julian let out a frantic, hysterical laugh, looking around at the guests for support. "She's mad. You see? This is the dementia I told you about. She's living in a fantasy." "It is not a fantasy to Detective Harrison, who is currently at the front gate with a warrant for your financial records," Beatrice replied, her voice gaining a terrifying edge of ice. "It is not a fantasy to the Newark Central Bank, which has already frozen the accounts you tried to drain. And it is certainly not a fantasy to these good people, who are about to hear the recording of you and Clara, planning to lock me in a ward to steal my final $102,000. She raised the small digital recorder she had hidden in the study the night before. She pressed the play button. Julian's own voice, cold and predatory, filled the ballroom. "I've already contacted the administrator. It's a locked ward. She's lived off my charity long enough. It's time she paid her way." The sound of the recording was like a physical blow. Clara let out a strangled sob and retreated toward the shadows of the dining room. Julian's mimosa glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor, a mirror image of the wine Beatrice had cleaned on her knees just 2 days prior. The investors, the friends, the elites, they all began to back away from him as if he were suddenly covered in a visible, infectious plague. They saw the $703,000 in debt. They saw the man who would devour his own sister. Beatrice stepped closer, her white uniform a blinding wall of morality. "You took my youth, Julian. You took my health. You took my father's legacy. But you will not take my dignity. From this moment on, you are no longer a miller." You are just a man standing in a house that is being repossessed by the truth. You have 24 hours to vacate this property before the sheriff arrives to enforce the injunction I filed this morning." Julian's knees finally gave out. The man who had spent his life looking down on others, who had called his sister a stain and a vête-neuf, collapsed onto the very floor she had scrubbed. He didn't just fall, he crumbled. The high melodrama of his life reached its final, pathetic climax. He reached out to grab the hem of Beatrice's white skirt, his fingers trembling, his face a distorted mask of snot and salt. "B, please. I didn't mean it. I was desperate. The debts. The $703,000. I'll lose everything." He began to cry, a loud, racking sob that was devoid of grace or strength. He wept like the child he had never truly outgrown, his forehead touching the cold marble. "I'm sorry, B. Please don't do this to me." Beatrice looked down at the weeping man. She felt the old, familiar pull of the sacrificial martyr in her chest, the urge to reach down, to lift him up, to tell him that everything would be okay, to work another 32 years to save him. But she looked at her gnarled, scarred hands, and she felt the ghost of the pumpkin pie on the ballroom floor. She saw the commitment papers he had prepared for her. "The love I had for you was a sanctuary, Julian," she said, her voice filled with a profound, final sadness. "But you turned it into a prison. I cannot save a man who has no soul to be saved. You wanted me to be a nurse? Then listen to my final diagnosis. You are the architect of your own ruin." She turned her back on him, not with anger, but with a terrifying, beautiful indifference. She began her walk of freedom, her white uniform shining like a beacon as she moved through the crowd. The guests parted for her with a newfound respect, a silent tribute to the woman who had finally found her boundaries. She walked out the grand front doors of the mansion into the crisp, biting air of a New Jersey winter. Behind her, the sounds of Julian's sobbing grew faint, muffled by the closing of the heavy oak doors. The aftermath was a slow, painful restoration of balance. Julian lost the house, the cars, and the social standing he had worshipped. He spent months in the wreckage of his own making, facing legal battles and the crushing weight of public shame. However, in the hollow silence of his poverty, a small, flicking candle of reality began to burn. Deprived of the money that had fueled his ego, Julian eventually found a low-level job in a warehouse, far away from the mansions of Bergen County. For the first time in his life, he felt the ache of manual labor, the sting of a hard-earned dollar, and the crushing weight of what he had thrown away. He began a long, arduous journey toward a quiet redemption, finally realizing that the old woman he had mocked was the only person who had ever truly loved him. Beatrice Miller returned to Newark, not to the slums, but to a quiet, sun-drenched apartment near the park. She used her $102,000 to open a small community clinic, where she spent her days teaching young nurses how to care for the soul as well as the body. She lived with a serenity that no mansion could ever provide. Her hands were still gnarled, and her back still ached, but she walked with the Q-Han, the pride, of a woman who had survived the Latin U-shape of agony and emerged as the master of her own fate. She had lost a brother, but she had found herself, and in the quiet of her new home, she finally knew the true meaning of peace. True love is the most sacred of virtues, but when it is offered without the fortification of boundaries, it ceases to be a gift and becomes a catalyst for the corruption of the soul. We often mistake the role of the martyr for that of the saint, believing that to suffer in silence at the hands of the ungrateful is a testament to our strength. In reality, unconditional devotion and given to the entitled only breeds monsters, transforming those we protect into the very predators who will eventually devour us. A sister's sacrifice or a mother's labor should be a bridge to a better life, not a carpet for the arrogant to trample upon. Financial and emotional independence in the sunset of one's life is not merely a luxury, it is the ultimate key to freedom and self-respect. We must learn that saying no to cruelty is the highest form of self-love. Only when we refuse to be a victim can we truly become the architects of a justice that honors our worth.